As you know, I like to talk about marine protected areas. It's what I studied when I was in graduate school. It's a bit of my passion. It's something that I believe will help protect our world's oceans. Actually, I know will help protect our world's oceans. But oftentimes I talk about it like everybody knows what I'm talking about. And I'm so happy that I found an article. Angelo Villagomez told me about this article that was coming out by Brian Owens on Hackeye magazine called Marine Protected Areas Explained. It's all about the nuance of how we protect our oceans. And so he gives the details in this article, which I'm going to talk about and why it's so important on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And this episode, before we get into it, is sponsored by the Build Your Career in Marine Science and Conservation. It's a program that I put together to help people literally build their career in marine science and conservation. It provides tips. It provides, how to apply to specific job ads. If I had those qualifications and what you could do to help apply for those, how you can better your cover letter, how you can better your resume, how you can prepare for an interview, all these different things all in one package. It's a private podcast because I think podcasts are really great. It's once a week you get an episode. It's a $5 per month. It's really easy and affordable. To be honest, the payment just goes to pay for the cost of doing the podcast. And I think that you can get a lot of value from it. So go over to speakupforblue.com/career. That's speakupforblue.com/career to get into that program right away. As soon as you sign up, you get access to all of the episodes that I've published. And there's about 20, just over 21. New episodes published every week. So check that out, speakupforblue.com/career. All right. Do you want to know about marine protected areas? This is the episode for you. In fact, what I'm going to say is after you listen to this episode or while you listen to this episode, if you're near a screen, go over to hackeymagazine.com and check out one of the most recent articles that was published on Oceans Day, June 8th, by Brian Owens. He put together a great article that has to do with all things about marine protected areas. So we're going to talk about what it is and what it means to have marine protected areas and sort of the nuances, like the differences in marine protected areas and so forth. So I've got a couple of points that I highlighted throughout the article so that you can just kind of listen to that. And I do highly recommend that you go in for the more details. I'll put the link in the show notes so that you can get access to them. All right. So essentially what it is, marine protected areas, or MPAs, are designated zones in the ocean aimed at conserving and protecting marine ecosystems. Oftentimes, they are protected for the benefits of biodiversity, habitat restoration, and making fisheries sustainable. So what that means is the MPA, the Marine Protected Area, will protect a specific area or areas depending on what we're talking about. And we'll get into that in a bit. But essentially, it protects a range or set of habitats. Like a specific area has sort of a boundary on paper that is not visible in the oceans, obviously. And essentially, what the idea is designed to protect that area. So it could be like a coral reef, it could be a seagrass bed, it could be mangroves, it could be all three, it could be two of those, it could be anything that is involved that is encapsulated in there. It could be like a spawning area, it could be it could be a nursery area. All these different aspects of the ocean get protected. And so what they do is they protect these areas to protect, say, like biodiversity. So when you protect biodiversity, you're protecting a number of different areas that are probably known to be high biodiversity. Like it could be the biodiversity of a set of habitats, right? Like I just mentioned, it could have like mangroves, seagrasses, and coral reefs, which are, probably have a number of different one of those to protect that biodiversity, protect all the species within it. So it protects those habitats and it protects all the different types of species and the number of individuals within each species all in that area. it's amazing. It's something that I highly recommend, when we talk about marine protected areas and protecting biodiversity. And also habitat restoration. It's designed to protect areas so that if you can't go in there, that area can regenerate if it's been sort of reduced in area or reduced in quality, right? So you have all these protected areas that come into play when you're trying to restore a habitat. And then fisheries. And this is where a lot of the MPAs come into play. And it's a lot of the conflicts that come up is when it comes to fisheries, because the idea is you just close off an area to fishing so that that area can regenerate in the number of fish and the size of fish over time, which does take time. And then the idea is as those fish grow and as the number of fish and number of species grow, it kind of spills over the boundaries and allows for people to start catching those fish as it spills over. That's the spillover effect that you often hear when we talk about marine protected areas. So a pretty important part in fisheries. Now, where it gets contested is fishers are like, well, this is where we like to fish. We don't want to close off this area for 5, 6, 7 years or permanently. We don't necessarily have the patience because, hey, we have to pay our bills. We have to feed our kids. We have to feed our families. And so a lot of times it gets a little contested there. It gets a little controversial when you close off these areas. But those are sort of the three big things and they're all overlapping too, but the three big reasons why we have marine protected areas. Now, there are different types of marine protected areas, including fully protected areas and multiple use areas. So fully protected areas means nothing could be extracted. So there's no activities whatsoever, right? So you can't, even scientists can't go in to do research. You can't do oil and gas drilling. You can't do mining. You can't do fisheries. You can't even snorkel. You can't even scuba dive in those areas. They're closed off, no human interaction, no human interference. Then you have multiple use areas such as the Great Barrier Reef, which can include fully protected areas within a network of marine protected areas. So the Great Barrier Reef is made up of a series of protected areas, and they all have different designations or different uses. So you can allow specific uses. So there's some areas that are they used to be known as marine reserves, which was like a fully protected area, nobody could go into it. Then there's other areas that are allowed only scientific researchers to go into to monitor it and see how it's doing. Then there's recreational use, snorkeling, kayaking, scuba diving, swimming, anything that is recreationally spearfishing. Well, maybe not spearfishing, but anything that's recreational, you can go in there and there's not as much interference, but it can handle the recreational use. Then there's fishing, so spearfishing, commercial fishing, recreational fishing, and even then they might have different uses for those. Those areas have that, so it's a little bit more resilient in what they've assessed, and so there's different uses for that. And then some have maybe multiple uses within one area. It all depends, but there are different. They're still designated, they're still managed. They're just managed differently. Okay, so that's essentially what it is. Now, fully protected reserves prohibit all extractive activities, allowing marine ecosystems to survive without human interference, just as I mentioned. So I'm reading some of these points that I wrote down. And I talked about multiple use areas. Now, MPAs play a crucial role in maintaining the health of marine ecosystems and preserving endangered species because it does close off anything to human interference. So that's quite important. Establishing and managing MPAs can be challenging due to conflicts with local communities who rely on marine resources. Now, there are different types of conflicts, okay, and they all matter differently. Now, there are the conflicts especially when you deal with local communities, they become a little bit more sensitive because people are relying on ocean resources or even coastal resources for survival, right, for them to live. Fishing communities will fish to not only feed their own families with the catch that they have, but also to sell that catch and to make money so that the kids can go to school, so their families have the right enough clothing and enough materials to survive, to have a good life. And it's not easy being a fisher these days. It's never really been an easy life. You're away a lot from your family. Fish populations go up and down. You're dealing with, boating, maintenance and gas and diesel and so forth. You're also dealing just with weather patterns and climate change and all that. So it's not an easy living. And so when you have artisanal fishers or local fishers who are just trying to survive and you're saying, hey, you know what, you can't fish here anymore, it can be very sensitive. And that's why when you designate MPAs, it's really important to put a committee of ocean, what we call users or ocean stakeholders, the people who work in the ocean, the people who use the resources from the ocean, depend on the ocean to live. So it gets a little sticky when it's local communities that are being affected by the MPAs, even if it's for the short term, 5, 6, 7 years, maybe even 10 years. Long term, 20 years and so forth. It's even worse, because they're used to fishing wherever they want. Now they can't fish in certain spots, and those could be the hot spots for fishing for them in the past, even though the fish population might be dwindling or not doing well. It's a tough sell. It's a tough sell because they're saying, hey, you can't fish here. You have to trust us long term. Whoever's doing this, whether it be government, usually it's government, or whether it be the community at large, it's a tough thing to sell. It is. It's not easy. I don't know how I would like that if I was a fisher, trying to just survive, and all of a sudden where I fished for the last 30 years, they say I can't fish anymore. It can be really difficult. Now, on the other hand, there's commercial fisheries, industrial fisheries, where you're looking at not just local fishers, but you're looking at, these large sort of trawlers that are, corporations and so forth. And them, I don't know how hard it is, but they definitely put up a lot of political opposition to it, where they have the money to, have lobbyists and things that can make it really difficult to put something together. And so that can be difficult as well. But when you do a marine protected area and you start the process to plan and create a marine protected area, it's very important to include all ocean stakeholders, big and small. Everybody deserves a voice at the table. Everybody deserves equal representation at the table, in my opinion. And I feel like that doesn't happen a lot, including the people who are fighting for the environment. That often doesn't get a big voice, and nonprofit organizations often are viewers only, observationists only, and they can only do observing. They can't really have a say. That can be difficult too, because who's speaking up for the environment in these processes when all these ocean users are coming into play and being like, hey, we want this piece of ocean, we want this piece of ocean, and then the idea is to protect the environment to help supply and help support all these other ocean users. However, there's not really a big voice for them when you do it. So there's a lot of challenges when you put together and plan an MPA. Also, adequate funding and resources are essential for the effective management and enforcement of MPAs. This is where it gets tricky. There's one part of putting together an MPA, planning an MPA, bringing people together, and then once you've actually agreed on everything and you're able to implement an MPA, now it's okay on paper. But how do we actually put things into action is another thing. And I always find this as a content creator myself, as a podcaster, as sometimes a YouTuber, someone who likes to create content to communicate, the ocean message that I like to communicate. I often find it interesting to compare these types of processes, because when you're a content creator, you have to create the content. You have to record. So if I'm doing a podcast, I have to record the podcast. I have to do I do some research on the topic that I want, and depending on how much I know about it in the first place, or if I don't know anything about it, if it's a news article, I want to do some research. I want to read other news articles. I want to see the comparisons. I want to kind of look online, see what people are saying, and try and see if I can get sort of a behind the scenes kind of act and to be like, hey, who knows more about this? Maybe get an interview on or so forth, and do a little bit of research. But then I record the podcast, which, my podcast can be anywhere between 10, 20, 25 minutes, sometimes 30 minutes, depending, 45 minutes if it's an interview, or an hour if we really get along. That's all. It depends on who's on. You can have anywhere between 10 minutes and 60 minutes of an episode. And so that doesn't take actually that long. And then I edit it, very briefly, and I put it together and I upload it. And that's one process. And a lot of people get stuck on that process when they first become a content creator because they're not used to it. Look, this is episode 1468. So I've been doing this quite a long time along with other podcasts. So I am not a rookie at doing this. So my process of actually creating an episode to me is a lot easier. But then that's like really 20% of creating the episode. Then the 80% is you got to promote the thing, right? You got to make sure that you're getting in front of as many people as possible. And this is a lot of times where podcasters fail, including myself. There's one thing to do is to publish it to all the podcasting apps when I press that one publishing button. And thank God for Libsyn. Liberated Syndication is my host for podcasting, and it just pushes it out to all the apps that I'm connected to. And there's at least a dozen apps that I'm connected to that people can listen to my podcast and help grow the reach of my podcast just by pressing a button. But then there's the other things that you want to do. You want to put social media posts, maybe take clips, which I often fail at. You want to put a blog post together. You want to put a LinkedIn article together. You want to do all these different things. You want to talk about it with people, or maybe make extra content to help promote it. And there's a lot of things that go into. Then you got to start promoting it and going through all the different channels and talking to people about it. And what I love the most is actually answering people if they have a question or a comment on the episode, or if even any kind of feedback. And then you have that conversation like I do on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. So it's at How to Protect the Ocean. People DM me, and I love it. I love to interact with the audience and have those kind of conversations. I try and get back to them as soon as I get it, so I don't feel like I'm ignoring them, because I want people to DM me as much as possible. And so there's that part. That part is the 80%. That takes up the most time, or supposedly takes up the most time. But a lot of times we don't do it. A lot of the times we don't have the time, or we don't have maybe the money dedicated to promote it the way we want to promote it. And that's a difficult thing. And the same thing happens with marine protected areas. It could be very difficult to have sustainable funding year after year after year, to not only pay for staff to manage the protected area, to monitor, or pay, outside third-party contractors to monitor, so you get the right audit on your MPA. Right. And then support staff for enforcement, whether that be community leaders, or whether that be somebody designated for it that gets paid to do it, which may be a little bit of both. But you need that funding. You need to pay to have dedicated staff to look after that marine protected area, or at least have people trained up and pay for the equipment, the boating, the gas to do the patrols and all that. Enforcement is probably the biggest gap we have now in marine protected areas. Enforcement and monitoring, because it's difficult. Some of these MPAs are massive, right? They're like millions of hectares, and you just can't look after it with one boat. Using satellite imagery and things like that can help, but it does cost money. And so having that funding, having that enforcement is critical to making sure that your park that you spent so much time and money already planning and implementing is not just something that's on paper and we just end up calling it a paper park. We want to make sure that enforcement's there, that funding's there, to make sure that this is an effective marine protected area. Now, we talked about this. It's the collaboration between governments, scientists, local communities, and stakeholders is necessary for successful MPA implementation, especially smaller groups, or groups that have often been excluded from the process. Indigenous groups, right? Local communities. That's a really important part, that they get a voice. And if you want to hear why it's important to get that voice, check out on YouTube the Upwell conference that just happened on June 8th, or June 7th, the day before this this article was published by Brian Owens on Hawkeye magazine. The other last thing is effective MPA management is crucial for achieving long-term ecological and socioeconomic benefits. So if you want your MPA to do well, you want the spillover effect, you want the growth in, sort of the fisheries, you want the protection of biodiversity, you want habitats to be restored because there's no human interference. It is very, very crucial to have effective MPA management and adapt to that management. A lot of times in MPA sort of science and MPA conservation, you hear the word adaptive management. That means you go through your whole management process and then you look at it and you analyze and say, hey, what can we change or what's needed to change with the times? And then you change that accordingly, right? For that positive effect. It may work, it may not work, but then you adapt again at all the different changing variables that happen. MPA management, MPA implementation is not easy. It's a very difficult thing, but it's an effective tool in our conservation tool belt. It is not the end all be all. That's okay, but it's very effective in what we want to do. And I've talked about articles, even last week, I talked about an article where we talked about how large MPAs actually don't take away from fisheries that's already established. And so it's important that we continue to come out with this research, that we verify and validate the effectiveness of large MPAs as well as small MPAs, and continue on with this with great communication, including all the ocean users and stakeholders, and continue on with establishing MPAs even beyond the 30 by 30, right? Let's just do it, not just because it fits a 30 by 30 or a specific number, but also that it fits the effective protection of our coastal resources. So that's all I have to say for this. It's a great article. Like I said, it'll be I'll put the link in the show notes. I highly recommend that you check it out. And I want to thank you so much for listening to, well, before we get to that, of course, don't forget, if you are interested in becoming somebody with MPA management, I want you to, check out the Build Your Career in Marine Science and Conservation program. $5 a month, weekly episodes, private podcast. If you want to get a job and build a career, this is how you do it. You sign up for that. A small investment with a big outcome. And so it literally change your life. So I know sounds big, but it is. It can change your life in the fact that if you always wanted a job in marine conservation, this is the way to go. By the way, in a couple of episodes, we're going to have one of the conservation journey stories of someone who is now in MPA management and did not have a science background. So that's going to be interesting. We're going to be talking to LVs and soon. I've done the interview. We're just checking to make sure that it can go ahead. So it'll be in the next 2 to 3 episodes. So check that out as well. And I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Angelo, and have a great day. Maybe share this with a friend, and we'll talk to you later, and happy conservation.